turn to the immigration debate, again front and center at the state capitol in Albany, with Republicans pushing for New York to end its status as a sanctuary state, which it's been since former Governor Andrew Cuomo signed an executive order back in 2017. Being a sanctuary state means New York generally limits its cooperation with federal immigration enforcement and limits the amount of time for so-called detainers when ICE asks local or state authorities to hold someone in custody beyond when they would normally be released. Republicans, including Senate Leader Rob Ortt from Western New York, just rallied at the state capitol. They're calling on the governor to reverse sanctuary status for New York and also for the Big Apple as a sanctuary city. Now, specifically, these bills from Republicans would require state and local police and also certain courts to notify ICE when a non-citizen is arrested. It would also reinstate the 365-day maximum for Class A misdemeanors. Lawmakers had moved that to 364 days because they wanted to avoid low-level crimes leading to immigration proceedings. And these Republican bills would repeal a 2020 law that banned federal agents from making civil arrests inside or near courts in the state. I talked about all of this earlier today with Senator Ortt. Senator, we appreciate you taking some time for us here. And, I'm sure we will both acknowledge here that this bill is probably not going to pass in Albany, considering Democrats control the Senate, the Assembly, and the governorship as well. But this is obviously something that is important to you. Tell us why this is necessary to change this designation.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to me, and I think it's certainly important to a lot of my constituents, and I think a lot of New Yorkers. This bill would attempt to try and get our arms around the root of why we have 175,000 people here with, sort of more coming. One of those would be to anytime someone is apprehended by law enforcement and they are in the country, in the state of New York illegally, federal immigration customs enforcement would be notified. Under current state law, that does not happen. That really is kind of when you hear sanctuary policy, that's what that is. In other words, someone gets arrested, federal immigration authorities are not notified, even when local law enforcement suspect or know that person is in the country illegally. They're actually precluded from doing that.
Mayor Adams was on Good Morning America recently, and I want to share part of a quote. He was responding to something that Nikki Haley had said about sanctuary cities and sanctuary states and how that relates into the crisis. And he said, "This has nothing to do with sanctuary cities. Migrants and asylum seekers are paroled into the country. They're here legally. And so when you have a national leader talking about sanctuary cities is the reason we're having this, it's telling me she's not knowledgeable on the real topic." He and others would argue the solution to the migrant crisis in New York City and in New York State would be to pass the bipartisan border bill that is now being blocked by Republicans in Washington. Where do you stand on that bill? Shouldn't this be solved at the border instead of here in New York State?
So I'm glad you brought that up, Michael. So I will say, first of all, I think Mayor Adams might be the one who's not as knowledgeable. If he thinks that migrants, asylum seekers, people who cross into the country illegally don't end up in New York because of New York's laws, then why would New York pass sanctuary laws? If there was no difference, if there was no impact, then why would we pass them? They know why they passed them. They passed them intentionally so that people who are here illegally are not subject to deportation, so that law enforcement cannot notify federal immigration authorities, so that federal immigration officials can't do the job that they have been sworn to do. But the idea that we need a bill to protect our southern border, the idea that we need a bill, the president needs a bill as the commander in chief to secure the southern border, I think is nonsense. And we could do it, and the president could even, with a new executive order, simply say they have to remain in Mexico while their asylum cases are heard, would have a huge impact on the number of people coming in and on our cities and states' ability to handle that influx.
The vast majority of people, of migrants in New York City, are seeking asylum, which is a legal process, so they are not here illegally.
That's not true. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Wholeheartedly. Everyone claims asylum. That's the word now. The word on the street is you claim asylum. Nobody comes and just everyone is claiming asylum because they understand how to play that process out.
But the issue is the border bill would change the asylum process. You would no longer be released into the country. You would go into detention, and it would open up spots so that there are enough detention facilities to hold those people. And it would speed up the asylum claim so that they could be done in 6 months instead of 6 or 7 years. Why wouldn't you support that?
I've never seen the federal government be able to speed up anything. I'm not in Congress. I'm not in Washington, D.C., thank God. But I will tell you, in New York here, there are things that we are doing that makes this worse for New Yorkers, that is driving up the bill for New Yorkers, and that it is making more dangerous and more challenging in New York. And that's where my focus is, on what we can do at the state level to try and improve this crisis that I think has been partly created by a failure of policy.
How would you respond to your critics who say getting rid of a sanctuary city or sanctuary state status would do nothing to reduce the flow of migrants, that you should instead put your efforts on trying to find an answer at the border, which would seemingly be this bipartisan border bill that, again, was negotiated by one of the most conservative members of the Republican Party?
Michael, I know you're very focused on this border bill. Again, I'm not in Congress, so I'm here to talk about this state bill and the state policy, which I realize, being controlled by Democrats, is going to be challenging.
But would it make a difference?
The governor herself said they should be deported. One of the reasons they're not deported, one of the reasons those migrants who attacked the cop are not deported, is because of New York state laws, which actually preclude federal law or local law enforcement from notifying ICE, hey, we have folks who are here illegally in our holding center. They beat up a cop, which is a federal offense, deportable offense. That didn't happen. They were released with an appearance ticket. Had that happened, they would be deported.
Finally, there have been some law enforcement officials over the years, because we've been talking about sanctuary cities for a long time, who have said that the importance of it is so you have people who are here who are undocumented, who don't have the fear of deportation by cooperating with criminal investigations and that sort of thing. How would you respond to that?
So obviously, I understand the impetus or the origination of that thought, right? In certain communities, especially New York City, let's take that, city of Buffalo, Rochester, where you have large immigrant ethnic communities. You want those folks to come into the light ultimately. But again, why? You want them to come into the light. You want them out of the shadows to get citizenship status. That's the goal. The goal isn't just to be here. The goal is to be a citizenship or a citizen of the United States. And why? Because citizenship comes with benefits that non-citizens do not enjoy. If you're going to come here illegally, asylum seeker, whatever the terminology or legal process, and if you're going to commit a crime while in the state of New York, assaulting a police officer, kidnapping a person forcibly, we know that there were alleged crimes in Cheektowaga. If you're going to do those things, that individual should absolutely know they're going to be deported, very likely, very possibly, if they break those laws. But that is not happening right now in the state of New York, and I think that's what we're looking to change.
Senator Rob Wirt, leader of the Republicans in the Senate in Albany, thanks for taking the time and taking the questions.
Michael, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.